How does the other side of you, if at all, does it show up when either you're deep in a script and you feel like that creative slice show up, or when you're in the middle of, a jazz performance and you feel like the structural, kind of comes in? How do those two interplay for you?
I think that when you use the analogy of left side, right side brain, that's not really what's going on. What's really going on is there's two different roles that you assume: observer and participant. If we think of it that way, then it's pertinent to everything.
On today's episode of the ProGuide, Wired magazine calls him the Dean of Automation. He served as product manager for automation technologies for Apple for over 20 years. Sal Soghoian. Today's episode of the ProGuide is brought to you by Small Pond Productions, the producers of this podcast. If you're looking to boost your brand's voice with professional end-to-end podcast production, whether it's an interview show or telling stories with audio, we walk you through every step of the process to make you sound great. Head to our website and download the free Podcasting Made Simple guide. 8 critical things you need to know before launching your brand's podcast. It's all available at smallpond.productions. Well, welcome everybody to this episode of the ProGuide. My name's Andrew J. Mason, and today we're talking to Sal Soghoian. He's the automation technology product manager for Apple for over 20 years. Wired magazine calls him the Dean of Automation. He's a musician with a love for piano and guitar. He has 2 albums available for purchase on Apple Music under the band name Blue Indigo, Catwalk, and To Be With You. And he also happens to be a self-taught programmer. We get into some really cool question and answers about right brain, left brain, logic, creativity, interplay, and a lot of Sal's history that maybe you haven't heard yet so far. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Sal Soghoian. Talk to me about this journey of self-teaching AppleScript, and you kind of hit on it a little bit before we hit record, but I want to kind of dip back into that too. And how did you end up on this path of AppleScript? My gosh.
AppleScript and I met each other totally by mistake, on a whim. I used to live in a music community, an arts community in Pennsylvania called Delaware Water Gap. That's the actual name of the town, because you're right on the Delaware River where the gap is coming in between the mountains. And it's in the Poconos. And it's a very famous arts and music community. And it has been for decades and decades. And I was living over a bar in there, and I bought a used Mac, and I taught myself. I was basically, sitting there pressing it, trying to figure it out. I had no instruction or anything about it. And I got a program called Ready, Set, Go, which was a page layout program, right? The early stages of page layout. There was either PageMaker or Ready, Set, Go. And I got Ready, Set, Go. And I taught myself how to use it. And I started making the menus for the bar, right? First thing I'm going to do is take these old menus, and I redid them, and I learned about kerning and fonts and stuff like that, and printed them out on a laser writer. I had a laser writer and everything. And next thing I know, the other businesses around town, beside the bar I was living at, started to ask me, can you do my thing over again? The little video shop and the diner, the Greek diner down the street. And so I started doing this. I went, wait a minute, there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And it appealed to me because it was, dealing with logic and creativity and all those kind of things. And I got pretty good at it. I moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, where I had lived before. I had gone to the University of Virginia at one time. And I got a job in a print service bureau with this lady, Jo Gibson. She had been in the print industry for 29, 30 years. And she taught me all the real stuff, about line letting and all those kind of things. But this was at the time of desktop publishing was just starting to become a concept. And we were getting in all these print jobs because we had a Linetronic. And I was constantly looking for new ways to do things and automate things, because when you got all these jobs coming in, flight checking them all is a pain. And So I was working with developers of Quark extensions, and I was coming up with these ideas and testing them for them. And I happened to have this thing from Apple Developer Magazine, and it said AppleScript, this English-like language that can control the actions of the computer and the applications. And I'm like, huh? So I got the DVD, or the CD or whatever it was on. And I'm sitting there, it's late at night, it's like after 11 o'clock at night or something. I'm sitting there and I'm trying to figure this out. It says, okay, applications have dictionaries, and you should be able to write this sentence in this application called Script Editor and run this sentence, and it should be able to control. Well, I was using Quark Express, was one of the apps we were using and publishing, and it was scriptable because Dave Shaver and Ralph Risch had worked with Tim Gill and put the dictionary in there. And I also used FileMaker Pro, which had some scripting support. And you could get a scriptable finder. I paid the $14 to get a 400K disk with the scriptable finder on it from Apple. And so the first script I ever wrote was for Quark Express. And it was this: set the color of the current box to blue.
Huh.
And so I wrote that script and I read it, and the box turned blue. And I went, oh, okay. All of a sudden, everything in my whole life just changed. I like fired all my design clients. I just worked constantly. I lived in that room for like months figuring this out. Like, what is this? Because all of a sudden, I had the power to control the machine. I didn't have to go to the developer I was working with and said, it'd be nice if it did this.
Yes.
Or can you make it do blah? I mean, there were great people to work with, some of the companies I was working with were really great and interesting people to work with, but this is mine.
That's right.
I could control this. And so I started working on it, and with a bent towards, design and publication, because I was working in a print service bureau. First thing I started doing was trying to figure out how to automate real estate publications. Because, in the grocery stores, they had these magazines with house description, house description, house description, that kind of stuff. And I'm looking at it going, well, that could just be a record in a FileMaker Pro database. And then this is a box. So all I have to do is figure out some way to relate that box to this. Well, I could use the MLS number, and I'll put the MLS number in a field over here, and then I'll tag the box with it, because you could tag boxes. And so I figured out how to write an AppleScript to get the information from the database into the box and format it, and started coming up with it. And then, I explored that, and I was able to do an entire page layout in 20 seconds, and it was accurate. It wasn't any mistakes. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I started working on that. And then I got into, well, why can't we take images? Why do I have to do all these halftones and stuff? It says I can scan it. Let me try this. And sure enough, it started working. The local real estate group in the county came to me, and we started doing their real estate publication. And I automated that, and I automated their cover. I did the first full color cover that was split electronically, all that. And I started, gaining a reputation, and I was writing scripts for companies. I got contacted by AT&T. AT&T says, can you write us a script? We got 40-page documents, and we have to find every occurrence of AT&T. It has to be this blue. It has to be this font, turn this way with this. And I said, no problem. That'll be $3,000. And, I'll write it in 10 minutes and then sit on it for a week before I send it to them to make them think I worked on it. Then I send it, right?
Yeah.
And I started getting a reputation, and I wrote the script for Better Homes and Gardens that did the fractions for their recipes, all this kind of stuff. And I started developing this whole thing. And then I got queries from magazines. Can you write an article about this? Can you tell people what you're doing? And I
Hmm.
started writing magazine articles on automation with, AppleScript. And then I started getting asked to speak at shows. So I had a collection of scripts I was selling through Extension, this company that sold Quark extensions, and I was selling these scripts. And I would speak at shows, and then I noticed that my audience was Apple people. They would stand there and and they came to me and they said, "We want you to join." And I go, "Well, why would I want to do that? You're asking me to take a 50% pay cut to join you."
That's right.
And they basically threatened to kill the baby, right? They said, "Well,
Oh.
AppleScript's going to die unless you come here." And it was basically a scheme by Shafas Syed, Chris Espinoza, Dara, and a bunch of people to get me on board. And I joined Apple in January of '97 as the AppleScript product manager.
Hmm.
And at that time, it was like the Poseidon Adventure, where the columns were falling down and Shelley Winters was doing the breaststroke through the hallway. It was insanity. It was really crazy, but that was the best possible thing for me because it meant that all the barriers were down and we could
Hmm.
actually take a vision and move forward with it. And that's how I got started with the whole thing.
Yeah. This isn't on my list. First of all, I love that little detail about them coming to you with a knife up to AppleScript saying, "I swear I'll do
Yeah, basically, yeah.
it. Don't make me do this." Um,
Well,
but I do appreciate when you talk about the vision for what it could be. What did that look like to you for AppleScript? You have in your mind, they say, everything's on the table, it's all available, and it's up to you. You have this vision for where you think it could go. What were you picturing when that was happening?
well, one of the things that I've just had as part of my life, that I think was taught to me by my father, was to look for the underlying principle behind something. You see something working, and you would look at it and go, "Why is that doing what it does? Why is it having that effect? Let's look behind here and figure this out.
Mhm.
Why does the clock do this? Why does the drawer come out like that?" And the underlying principle behind AppleScript was this empowerment that you could have access to the APIs of the operating system or the applications in a way that wasn't so complex that you had to write code and compile and do all those kind of things. So if you got that concept, then you want to have it apply to everything.
Mhm.
But what happened is when I joined Apple, it was really more of rather than a technological challenge, it was more of a political challenge. Because at that time, AppleScript was not part of the operating system. We're talking like System 7, right? Before System 8. I got there just before System 8. System 8 was the first one that I was involved in. And it was not part of the operating system. It was an extra that you got, that you had to buy. And so I soon discovered that the way that Apple work is, if you have a technology, you have something and it doesn't have somebody representing it, then it can die quickly. You need somebody like a member of Congress to represent that technology and to protect it and make the deals necessary to advance it forward.
Hmm.
So the first challenge I had with AppleScript when I got there was just keeping it alive. Have AppleScript and the concept of automation had many near death experiences. And a lot of my time in the early days was just involved in the practicality of making relationships and making deals and having knife fights in the hallway to get this thing to keep going. It wasn't that, I didn't have the vision for, okay, everything should be scriptable and that this is what you could do with it. I saw what you could do with it because that's what I was doing for a living. But the practical situation at the time was that it needed representation. It needed somebody to keep it alive. And so my challenge was constantly trying to get the resources. And so, at one time, AppleScript was put under ColorSync. They didn't know what to do with it. So I reported to the ColorSync product manager. It was like, what? It took forever and all kinds of stuff. And then, it was massive shakeups. And one day I lost my boss's boss, my boss, my my peers, lost them all in one day. It was just like total clear house. And I was left. And it was like, and people were coming to me with their projects saying, can you keep this alive? And give me the source code for their projects. And like data detectors, they gave me their stuff trying to keep it alive. It was very challenging in those days, but at the same time, in that challenge, in that period of turmoil, all these opportunities showed up because there was no layers of blocking. If I had a concept that something needed to be scriptable, I'd find out who in the OS is working on that, and I'd go over to his office or her office, right? And I'd show them what I was doing and say, look, if we do this and connect this to this, then all of this is possible. And it was like, okay, open up the code, change that right there. Let's try it out. Yeah, that makes a difference. Let's put it in, submit it. And then it became a challenge of trying to figure out how to get stuff past Kim Kofit, who was like the guardian of the code. And when I would walk in the room, they'd be like, okay, what are you doing here? Because I had been caught many times with my hand in the cookie jar trying to get stuff in the door, right? And so fortunately for me, I got to work with one of the most brilliant people I ever met at Apple, and a wonderful human being is Chris Espinosa. Apple employee number 8 was my engineering counterpart. And Chris was just fantastic to work with. He had been there since it was in the garage.
Wow.
And yeah, Chris is Apple employee number 8. He's like one of the original guys. And the challenge, he and the QuickTime product manager at the time kidnapped the code base and basically took it off the server and had it. And they brought me on board to protect it. And he made a deal with Steve Glass to get AppleScript to become part of the operating system so we could be protected. But at the same time, we had to give up our autonomy. So we couldn't just rev when we wanted to. We couldn't do what we wanted to. We had to go through the system processes, but Steve protected us, Steve Glass protected us. So that's the first challenge, is we had to get into the operating system. And then at the same time, Apple had let go a lot of the guys like John Pugh and Don Olson that were part now of the OpenDoc stuff. The AppleScript team had been absorbed by them, and they let them all go. And I remember that day when they all went out the door, and I'm watching my heroes and these people that I've admired for years just leave and get picked up by Adobe and everybody else. So it was a challenging time, but it enabled me to make the relationships and the political structures so that it could get in place. And then Steve came. And my relationship with Steve was definitely one of the reasons I think that it survived. The first time Steve and I met was in town hall in front of about, 80 people, all product marketing. Steve called us in there, and he was ranting about how we sucked and how we couldn't market our way out of a paper bag, and how it was easy when we were 100 times better than Windows, but now that we're not, you don't know what to do. And the first words I said to Steve, I stopped him. I said, no, you're wrong. And he turns around, and he looks at me, and he goes, and you are? I said, I'm Sal Soghoian. I'm the AppleScript product manager. You're wrong. My technology is 100 times better than Windows. And we just went at it, you know.
Hmm.
We just locked horns and went. Steve says, well, that's not what I'm hearing. And I said, your guys are lying to you. They're not telling you the truth. He goes, well, they say that nobody's using it. I said, everybody's using this. What are you talking about? Half our procedures are built on this stuff. And it that was like the beginning of my relationship with Steve. He understood that I would tell him the truth, and that what I would tell him, I had backed up. I knew that
Yes.
this was reality. And so there was numerous times that I went to him, and it made a difference that we got the resources we needed. Like when we wanted, one of the challenges we had was we wanted to become part of the development environment, but we weren't. We were just like this scripting language off to the side, and everything else was this objective C and C++. And I had a friend that was vice president over in marketing or something, and he had ridden in the plane with Steve from New York, from a Macworld, and he told me about some of the conversations they had. He told me Steve's favorite movie. He said, Steve's favorite movie is Patton. You won't believe it, but it's Patton. And I went, well, that kind of makes sense,
Yeah.
right? And so I came from a military family, so I know how to speak military. So I wrote Steve an email. I said, Steve, look, I'm just a sergeant. I'll do what you tell me. I'll go where you want me to go. I'll fight the fight. I said, but you got me out here in the middle of nowhere with no supply line. How am I supposed to take it to Microsoft if I don't have the stuff that I need to, get ahead?
That's right.
And I sent it off to him. It was like the middle of the night, like midnight, 1 o'clock.
Complete military metaphor.
Total, it's like, I'm a dutiful soldier. I'll do what you tell me to do, but you got me out here in the middle of nowhere. Next day, I get a call from Espinosa going, what did you do? I said, what do you mean? He goes, what did you do? We got a meeting today with Avi and Phil. And so I said, well, I sent this letter to Steve. So the next day we go in to see Avi and Phil, and they said, what do you need? What do you want to do? Do you really want to take this? I said, no, man, we got this great technology. We need to take it to them. And what do you need? And they said, well, what do you need to take it to them? Do you want to buy like a third party that's already got some kind of interface thing? Or what do you want to do? And Espinosa says, no, we want to be part of Project Builder and Interface Builder. And Avi, who had been sitting there kind of like, I got to do this. And went, oh, I can understand that. He goes, yeah, we want to be a peer development language. And they went, okay, how, what do you need? And Espinosa goes, one engineer. He goes, what? He goes, we need Tim Bumgarner. And there was this brilliant man who could architect the thing and figure it out. And so he goes, you got him. And that changed everything, because then we became a development language. We could actually make an app out of AppleScript using Aqua and everything else. And that all happened because of my relationship with Steve.
I love that.
And I didn't win every time. There was, times that SJ would referee like fights between me and other guys trying to get them scriptable. Like I lost the fight with Final Cut. I was getting calls from CNN and everybody else all the time about they needed automation. I had worked on an automation for Viacom. My friend Dirk Van Dahl was a VP over there. And I had spent like a couple weeks on site in New York automating their media, using Media 100 was an application that was scriptable for the Mac. And we automated the creation of all their promos, those little things that go, tomorrow on, FX channel, we have Bob Discovers America, know. And it would have like a certain video background with overlay text and things. And it turned out that the guy that was recording those they would sit there and they would do them all in one take. And he would sit there and just read one after another with 10-second intervals in between. So I wrote a script that would hack all that up, take those, put them on a thing, figure out what, based upon the name, what of the 13 channels that they had, pull of the appropriate video background, put it in, open up Photoshop and Illustrator and create all the text overlay, put it in there with an alpha channel, build the entire thing, lay them all out on one line, and then somebody would sit there and scrub through to make sure they're all correct. Then another script would cut them all into sections, send them high res up to the media server and a low res over to where the execs could review it from a web page, all built with AppleScript, right?
Wow.
So I was trying to get the Final Cut guys to do this, and I couldn't convince the engineers that they needed to spend the time and do it.
Oh my
and
gosh.
AppleScript was the kind of thing you want to do when you're writing the code. Re-architecting it later is a pain,
Yeah.
right? It's really hard. And I was trying to convince them, and I couldn't make progress. So I pulled a move on them and Steve, it turned out, too. I used to speak at the Executive Briefing Center, and I knew that HBO and a bunch of the guys from New York were showing up. So I asked Viacom, I said, hey, can I show your solution to your competitors? And they're like, okay. Yeah, you know, they're doing like, all of a sudden they're doing 1,800 of these things that used to take like weeks with 4 guys back to back. They're doing in like 30 minutes with a bunch of scripts.
Oh my
right?
gosh. Yes.
So I got into the queue of people that were going to show those things. I was the last one. And I showed them, I said, look, Viacom said I could show you this. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, what? And I showed them, and their faces went like, pong.
Sure.
And then after me, I left. After me was SJ. And Steve came in, and the first thing those guys said to him were, we want automation. We want what we just, and he didn't know anything about it. So I basically set him up to get bombarded, right? Thinking, okay, I'll get them asking for it. Maybe that'll give me some leverage.
That's a brilliant move. I love it.
It turned out it didn't work, you know, and in the end, SJ said, look, I got to go with the engineering manager. They say they don't have the time or the resources. We're way behind on this. I'm sorry, we can't do this. I was like, okay, I tried. You know, that was my attitude. Some things, you know, like Automator, Steve got, and he made it part of the operating system. But sometimes I lost as well. But it was basically because that relationship with him allowed us to get the resources to keep moving automation forward. And we did. You know, AppleScript, we got over to the PowerPC. We kept making advances with it all along the way. You know, then it became AppleScript Objective-C. Chris Neville came up with that, and it just blew everything away, because then you could call into all the Cocoa frameworks directly. But when Steve died, you know, we lost a really valuable ally, and the company changed, and it became a lot of stovepiping. And my previous thing of having horizontal relationships between groups to keep automation as a primary mover hit walls.
Yeah.
And it was more difficult to become effective in those days around that situation. So that's a long answer to your question about AppleScript, but that's basically what it was about.
Yeah. I love every minute of that. That's awesome. And I love the Viacom story. That's fantastic. I would love to jump into this intersection that you had of music, and in particular jazz, and technology. And for you, it sounds like music was kind of the groundwork, the framework that came first. And out of that, or alongside of that, later was developed this, the scripting and the aha moment with the blue box,
Right.
and Quark and everything.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how you might think that one of those disciplines or areas might inform the others, and if there's any any or what that relationship might look like for you.
There's a lot of similarities. There's basic principles that I've found throughout my life that are relevant, that are constant across knowledge bases, that are constant across technologies. You know, there are certain things that are just basic truths that pertain to all of them. For example, you know, you looking for the underlying principle. When it comes to it, if you're dealing with music, you know, what's the underlying principle behind what you're doing? Why does a set of chords feel a certain way? Why does this type of resolve happen here? You know, you look for the underlying principle behind something in the same way as, you know, why a clock mechanism works a certain way. And once you understand the underlying principle behind something, then you can replicate that and you can build upon it and take it forward. But if you're just working with what's on the outside, then you don't have the depth and the understanding to move it forward. Whether that's music or whether it's automation technology, the principle is the same. You know, what's the underlying principle? And it's basically empowerment. You know, the fact that automation's basically some type of messaging system where you're telling applications what they should be doing, and the user is directing the movement and the control. And once you understand that, then you just figuring out the technology that's necessary for that particular application becomes more apparent. There's also things about, in order to succeed, it was a lot of the time, like I mentioned, it was political initially, until it became something that was more ingrained and accepted as being part of that whole environment. And that depended a lot upon personal insight and personal belief in yourself, you know, being okay with what you know, and being okay with the concept of challenging the status quo, you know, doing what it takes to get the goal, you know, within reason, but you have to try to figure out that everything that got done was really personal relationships. And I became notorious for certain kind of things. Like, I was famous for putting bounties on code. I would put a bounty up in the elevator, $1,200 for somebody that can write me code that does blah. Like the QuickTime player, to get that scriptable was a bounty in the elevator in building 2. Pardon me. For somebody who could write me code. And with about 30 minutes, I got a couple calls from guys. Is this serious? I said, yeah, I'll give you $1,200 in cash if you write me code to do a player. And here's what it has to do. And they would write me, somebody wrote me the code. I won't mention names or anything. And then I said, you know, okay, strip it, take out your identifiers, your job numbers, everything. I said, just give me the code. And then once I had that, was figuring out how to get it in, you know, making a deal with somebody else to put this in here or install it into there. There was a lot of things in the operating system, like the number one used Apple script command is called do shell script. Well, I purchased that. There was a guy I bought the code for that from, and it took me a while to figure out how to get it into the operating system, but it got slid into a build, you know, and once it was in there, it became used by everybody. And it's still like one of the most number one used things, but it was basically a bounty. I paid some engineer. And then there were certain guys that wouldn't accept money. So I used Legos. The famous Star Wars Millennium Falcon. I used to buy the Millennium Falcon kits, and I would come into an engineer and I'd put it on his desk, and they'd look at it like, oh my, this is something that they can't justify to their wife spending $500 on a Millennium Falcon kit. But, it's like, you just give me the code, I'll take care of the rest of it. And there
Let's
was
be
a lot of
honest.
things that needed to be done, but that's just all process of establishing the sensibility of it. Once people started seeing the practicality and the necessity of automation, then it took on a life of its own and got accepted. But I had to be confident in who I was, and in order to risk that, they could have fired me.
Yeah.
But the way I looked at it is, they asked me to be there. I was trying to do the right thing and advance the technologies and keep it going and moving it forward. And, if I had to kind of fudge things here and there and make deals, then that's just the way it was. Because then in the end, the right thing got done. And the original work that was by all of these fantastic engineers and people involved in that has been carried on, and now it's ingrained. And you have the automation frameworks that are so essential, and they're part of all of Apple's stuff now. They're not going to go away. There's no
That's right.
question about whether they're going to be there anymore. And that's wonderful, because the people that are using it are just have that opportunity. But it's all from basically being confident in the rightness of what you were doing and trying to move it forward.
I love two things I'll call out on that before we move forward. And one is this sense where humility and confidence, they aren't necessarily diametrically opposed to each other. You believe so much, you're so confident, and it's coming from a place of authenticity. But it's also this
Yeah.
open hand where you're talking about Viacom, like, hey, I tried, I did my best, I did what I thought was working. I wasn't tight-fisted enough to where it's like I have to have my way.
Yeah.
The other
Yeah.
slice I love about this is how not myopic it is too. So many of us, if we're into code or programming and that's our thing, we think about our one job, our one role. And this is like really zooming out, saying, okay, let's begin with the end in mind here. What are we really all here trying to accomplish? And these
Right.
alternate approaches, like the Millennial Falcon or
Yeah.
code bounty,
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. It's there's a truth about automation. The truth, the power of the computer should reside in the hands of the one using it.
Hmm.
That's been a core fundamental creed for me. And that's a truth that, I just followed. That's my belief, and that's what I was pushing for at Apple the whole time I was there, almost 20 years. And when you know that to be true, and it's so empowering, and you see that it changes people's lives, literally changes people's lives for the better, it becomes easier to become a champion for it and to push it, because it's the right thing.
That's right.
Then it just becomes a matter of, trying to solve problems. Like we had to work with the security guys, Yvonne Christick's team. And basically two diametrically opposed philosophies. Automation wants everything wide open, and the security team wants everything, tight. And those guys are so brilliant, and their attitude was constantly, how do we make this work? And working with them was just fantastic. And we figured out this whole concept that's still in use today, that if the user installs this at a certain place, the operating system will run your scripts. And the act of the user installing it means that the user wants this to have power of the user, that the application can't install it, but the application can ask the user to install it. So, you have this engine, the script engine, I don't know how they're doing it now in the latest builds. It was basically like there was a script engine that would run Apple script and shell scripts for you. The system would do it. And you had to put your scripts in certain locations to have them approved, right? Mm-hmm. And that resolution between the two teams was brilliant. And it's still working today. But it didn't happen on iOS. iOS that's unfortunately there was this political situation where there was like different teams in different buildings that weren't allowed to communicate with each other, and you couldn't, make the relationships. There was, idea barrier doors, glass doors that would separate you, and they didn't take it on. We approached the iOS team numerous times with basically the concept behind what shortcuts is today
Yeah.
back then, but they didn't want it. So they hard coded everything, and it got in a mess. And now you have this wonderful architecture on macOS, but it's not duplicated on iOS. I mean, one of the things that I wish could have happened would be that there would have been a universal scripting language for all of Apple's products, so that it would be, you write the script once and it goes everywhere. Like what I've been working with the Omni Group.
Yes.
Omni Group uses JavaScript based on WebKit, core JavaScript, so that you write a script for an Omni application, whether it's running on your phone or your iPad or your Mac, it's going to run the same. And it's everywhere. It's device independent. That was always my goal for Apple, and unfortunately, that didn't happen. There was also another goal that we were trying to get to. I worked with the Siri team for many years. I worked with the speech team, and then the Siri team came on, and I worked with them. And we actually had the prototyping engine for Siri. They had this engine based on JavaScript. We had it tied into AppleScript and to Apple events. And there was we had as a prototype hundreds of commands to control all the iWork apps, photos, the Finder, everything. It was all voice controlled, and it was natural language. You didn't have to memorize a phrase. It was just you tell it what you wanted to do, and it understood. And we presented this all the way up to the top levels, and people were stunned. Literally, I gave presentations on this with my partner from the Siri team, Philippe, and the room was silent. And then applause. It was just like knocked the breath out of them, because we were doing this with Siri, but the problem was that it was on the Mac. It wasn't on iOS. And I think that caused problems because they didn't want iOS to look bad. Not bad, but not as capable, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned in working with Steve was I used to think of it this way. It's not my job to make you look good. It's my job to push the envelope. And I come up with a solution that just keeps pushing it. Early on when he came back on board, there was a meeting in the boardroom. Some reason I was called into it. Steve called a bunch of the product managers and people into the boardroom over in building 1. And and he basically laid it out that we had to out innovate, out maneuver, out deliver everybody else, all of our competition. That's how we win, is we just have to keep pushing the envelope. And he had a direction to go that he had in mind. And so the trick was aligning what you want to do with that direction too. But it was the whole thing, keep pushing the envelope. And I wasn't really concerned that, would make the work that we had with automation and Siri would make another group look bad. We just wanted to keep pushing the envelope. So I actually gave a talk at WWDC about, I used the standard dictation software as an example. I didn't show the Siri prototyping, but I showed this whole thing, and it upset a lot of people. They actually pulled the session. It was session 717, 2016. And I gave the session, and then they took down the videos like a week later.
Wow.
But you just have to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't.
Yeah. I'd love for you to talk to me about this kind of back and forth or maybe it is just integrated, however you'd like to approach it, but this right brain, left brain the musical side and the side that is, logical and code functioning. How does the other side of you, if at all, does it show up when either you're deep in a script and you feel like that kind of creative slice show up, or when you're in the middle of, a jazz performance and you feel like the structural, kind of comes in? How do those two interplay for you?
It's, I think that when you use the analogy of left side, right side brain, that's not really what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
What's really going on is there's two different roles that you assume: observer and participant. If we think of it that way, then it's pertinent to everything. For example, if you take a musician like Phil Woods, when I lived in the Poconos, Phil was a local guy and amazing musician, just phenomenal, constantly voted like best alto player in the world. But if you take Phil and he's playing in a group and you could if you could say, Phil, stop, and then ask him, okay, what's going on right now? Phil could tell you everything that he was doing, the arc of where he was going, what's happening, who's playing what over here, what the bass note is, what's the harmony back here. He could tell you exactly everything that was going on at that moment. But that's the observer side. At the same time, he was the participant, the creative flow of ideas and his response to all of the things that are going on with the rest of the group. And his natural inspiration is allowed to come out at the same time. You assume the role of both participant and observer. And this pertains to anything that you do. It can be with a conversation with another person. By being both participant and observer, you can correct and adjust for mistakes that you make, because you can see you're observing the result of the impact of what you're saying on this person. But at the same time, you're going, oh, that was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That was not right. I should have said this. I didn't mean that. Whatever. It gives you the chance to correct. Participant and observer, it works with everything. It's the creative and it's the observant and the rational, all that stuff. But if you really think of it in roles, it works with everything that you do in life. And that's important, because I think the saving grace that we have as human beings is the fact that we live in forward motion. I call it forward motion. We're constantly moving forward. We can't go backwards, right? You can't go back in time and correct that bad note. I played the wrong note. You can't go back. But you can recognize that and you can develop a tool that, okay, let's think of it this way. I'm in the river. I'm in a river that's moving and the current's moving and I can't go back upstream strong, right? But I have a paddle and I can recognize that there's a rock coming up and I can turn the paddle to get me to move to just to the left of it, or a crag coming out of the water, some branch or something. I can make adjustments. Having forward motion gives us the ability to adjust, to correct mistakes, to correct deficiencies, to correct defects of your own character or whatever, right? And that also applies to everything else you're doing. And in order to make that work, you have to be the guy steering, but at the same time, you got to be the guy looking. So you have to be observer and participant in everything that you do. And that's what musicians do. That's what great artists do, that they observe and they participate at the same time. When you're writing code, it happens the same kind of way too. You're both observer and participant of what's going on. And so I like to think of it in terms of that rather than I'm using this side of my brain or that side of the brain. You know, you try to maintain that balance between observer and participant so that you don't go too far into one and not the other. That's what I look at it as.
Oh my gosh,
Does that
Sal.
make
It
sense?
does. You just said that phrase, forward motion. I'm thinking about that now as you're talking. And and you mentioned too, it can happen in conversations too. So I guess the observer is starting to think
Yeah,
about that. So
yeah.
in your life, you've had some really great, wonderful forward motion that's happened. And as that arc continues to move forward, uh, what else would you love to see show up for you? And this is super open-ended. It can be career, it can be life, it can be anything. But what else in the realm of forward motion would you like to see happen for Sal Soghoian?
Well, I think that we're all at an incredible moment in the history of mankind right now. It's obvious to anybody that's paying attention that we are at an inflection moment in history, like none other that we've ever faced. The whole thing going on with climate, you know, it's been my experience that if you're a person that requires pain to learn something, that it will be provided to you in the amount required. That, if I really, if that's the way
Yeah.
I learn by doing that, then you'll get what you need.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that principle applied to the world at large, that all of society is now becoming aware. We're getting levels of pain that are making us aware and having to respond. And that means we're going to do fundamental changes in the way that we perceive, that we represent, that we have government, that we do economy. Everything's going to be happening. I see that as incredible disturbance kind of thing. But at the same time, it's been my experience, like I was describing when I was at Apple and during this whole turmoil, that was the time that the solutions were born and begun to be integrated. And I think that's going to happen now. I think that the world's going to be facing things where the solutions are going to be coming up, the creativity, the technology, the people, the determination, the character, all of those things are going to be called to the fore. And we have to think about, well, what's my place? Where do I fit in this? And how's this going to affect me? But also at the same time, how am I going to be involved in it? You know, it's all about the timing. And this is our time in the world. And so I see, as scary as it is, I do get hope in what I see some of the things that are happening with people. Some people are very passionate about it, and some of the solutions we're coming up with are really incredible and amazing. And I have hope that humanity can respond. At the same time, I understand it's going to be a very painful process that we're going to go through because the world that we know is never going to be the same. You know, I'm never going to have a need for a sled. When I was a kid, there used to be snow on the ground, and you would buy, every kid had like a beat up sled that we used to take and stuff. And then it stopped snowing, and there's no more of that. So things are going to change, but I think out of it, it gives us the opportunity to become tighter and more understanding and more empathetic and to figure out solutions together. It's going to be challenging, but I think that's what's happening. And trying to figure out your own place in that is interesting too. Every one of us, you as a father,
Yeah.
have to be thinking about, okay, this is affecting my family. What's going to happen? You know, everybody's going to be involved in this somehow. And it's together that we're going to solve and come to some kind of solution. It's not going to be changing it back to what it was, because that's gone now. And it will take thousands of years to change it back. But we're going to come to a solution and an answer. And we're going to do it together, because that's just the necessity of it. And the pain of it will force us into that.
Sal?
Is that too heavy? Yes, that's like, I just feel like I hit you with a Nerf gun. Like, come on,
No, I would not change a minute of this conversation. I love every bit of it. And I appreciate, even with the full realization, from what I consider to be a very brilliant person, of the magnitude of the challenge that's ahead of us. Also the optimism that's tied in with, you know what, when you change when you're forced to. And, it looks like we might be getting there sooner than later. So
you're a blessed person if you can learn from the mistakes of others.
mm,
And there's been many times I've been able to learn from the mistakes of others, and I'm so grateful for that. You know, I am a blessed human being. The fact I'm still here and that I get to contribute and make contributions in a variety of ways, and that I have a wonderful partner to share my life with. I'm a blessed person. And, you know, we will all do this together. We'll figure out how to clump together in that river and keep going. We'll make this happen.
that's right.
We will succeed.
That's right. Sal, always an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for this time. And our thanks to all of you for listening. If you're looking for a quick way to make our day, a review in iTunes or subscribing to this podcast would mean the world to us. Our thanks to Small Pond Productions for sponsoring. And this was the ProGuide. Learn from leaders, change your life. See you, everybody.